Okay, and hello and welcome to today's session on evidence-based guidelines for live synchronously online instruction or teaching. My name is Brandon Taylor. I'm one of your friendly neighborhood instructional designers from the Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation, which is led by Dr. Angela Solik in the academic affairs area, which is headed by Dr. David Katz. Who's the vice provost for that academic affairs area. So today we're going to try to help you become armed and dangerous with the best practices for teaching live online with that. So I won't read the overview with it, but basically today's objectives as listed are basically for you to become aware of and list some of the best practices, evidence-based practices for teaching live online, and to be able to apply some of those evidence-based practices for teaching live online. And so this is our proposed agenda, but feel free to ask questions as we move along with that, and I will either try to answer them, or if we're kind of short for time, I will answer them later as we get to that point in the session, or in the follow-up email with the recording for that. I do want to note that all the handouts and information that I'll be talking about or using in the session will be sent to you as well. So you can feel free and rest assured that that's what will happen. I ask as far as housekeeping that if you're not speaking, that you would please mute your microphone, but you can feel free to unmute your microphone to ask a question. You don't have to raise your hand or anything like that. But if you can mute it if you're not talking with that. So just quickly, these are kind of the main best practices that we're going to talk about. You may know others. You can please feel free to share that. But these are some of the basic best practices. So pre-engineering or planning before, which goes with any instruction, whether it's live, online, or otherwise. Use diverse delivery media components. So a variety of media and resources. Obviously, you want to make it job relevant, explicitly job relevant, and keep it interactive. Have social presence and make sure you promote the learning and the attainment of the learning outcomes and objectives. Appropriate visual and verbal modalities to facilitate, and then cognitive load. So I'm going to go over these, some resources with each of these, but this is kind of the overview of what we'll talk about. Do we have any questions at this point? Or comments or cynical remarks? Okay, so the first thing I'll bring to your attention is that at Rush, we have about half of our course delivery options involve live online instruction. So this is the definition and course code sheet for Rush. So this is available on the city website. But just wanted to share this with you that in Rush, we do have courses even prior to COVID-19 that use live online instruction. So the online virtual instruction uses live or synchronous instruction. The online synchronous course delivery mode at Rush uses synchronous instruction. The blended virtual modality uses synchronous instruction. And one of our newest course delivery formats, which you've probably been hearing a lot about, what the COVID-19 pandemic plans for the fall, is a HyFlex course delivery mode, where in the HyFlex course, in any given HyFlex course section, Students can participate live in the classroom if safe to do so, and they choose to do so. Live online, so through Zoom, if you will. And then asynchronous online, so through Blackboard or for our medical college colleagues through Elantra, or any combination thereof. I like to use the old Burger King slogan, HighFlex is the way the students can have it their way. And quite frankly, it's modality that faculty can have it their way. As we know, many faculty fall under the demographics that might be more susceptible to illness and fatality from COVID-19. So again, we'll share this with you as well. So this session is not about what to click and what to do in Zoom. There's some resources in Blackboard for the OTDC course with some videos and links. I just show this to you. This is in there as an example. What's in there is the tips and tricks for educating with Zoom. So it has some information, and then it also has links to videos and other support site resources rather for Zoom by Zoom. So this is in the OTC. I just wanted to bring you to the attention, but we're not going to talk about what to click and do in Zoom. That's another session. Really want to talk about the strategies, pedagogical strategies and planning for your workshop. And so what I would like to know, does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, so what I will do then, since you don't have any questions, or even if you had questions, I would do this. I'm going to launch a poll, and you should see a poll about whether or not you have used any web conferencing system. And you can check all that apply, and then there's an other, because obviously I could not list all of the systems. And so if you'd be so kind as to complete this, good. I see we have, I'll give you a few more minutes. All right, excuse me, a few more seconds, not minutes. So we're at 30 seconds now. I'll give you 30 more seconds in case you want to change your bets, if you will. So about 10 more seconds. Looks like everyone has responded. So I'll go ahead and end the poll. And so I'm reviewing the poll. So I'm kind of modeling how you would do. So before you share the poll with your learners or participants, you can actually view the results before you share it. So that's what I'm doing now. And then now I'm going to share the results with everyone, and you should see the results. And so I'm not surprised by this results here at Rush. We license Zoom and WebEx. And so everyone has indicated that they've used WebEx and Zoom. Skype for Business looks like it comes in third in this group, and GoToMeeting and Google Meet to Hangout. And no one chose other. Okay. So I'll stop sharing the results. So that's a simple example of how you can engage students and your learners, participants, by doing polling with Zoom's built-in polling feature, or you could use another polling feature such as Poll Everywhere, or even Microsoft Forms or Google Forms as well with that. So I'm going to go next and start talking about the content that we're addressing today, the best practices. So I want to bring your attention to this book that I'm using for many of the handouts. It's by Cindy Huggett. A great book. What's nice about this book, and I don't have any financial ties to this book or the company or any publishing or to Cindy. It's a nice book. It has plenty of checklists. I know in healthcare, you know, people like checklists. And it has fillable templates for your planning and with it. So it's really nice. So I'm sharing some snippets of the book with you. So you'll get the link to these handouts as well. When you purchase the paper copy, you get a code to get the electronic copy for free, which is nice. I always like that. So just wanted to bring your attention to that. And so we will go into it. So the first thing is to know what tools do you have at your disposal. So this sheet kind of lists some of the popular tools or common tools that you would have in your web conferencing system that you would use for your live online session. I won't go through all of these since everyone has used at least two, has reported using at least two web conferencing systems. What I will note though is I highlight a few of the items. So the whiteboard is really helpful where you can draw on the screen. So you can even paste images there. We talked about polling. As we said, you have an internal poll, or you could use a third-party polling software. And then breakout rooms. So if you use Teams in your teaching and learning practices, and you break out into tables for teams or group work, breakouts or breakout rooms, those are your virtual tables. So you can place people beforehand if you know all of the participants in Zoom before your session, or if you don't know all the participants beforehand, you can do it on the fly during the session as well. And then finally, application sharing, which is what I'm using now. I'm basically sharing my screen, but I could share just the PowerPoint. I could share just the web browser with that. Okay. Any questions on common tools for live online teaching?
Brandon, I have a question. It's Kathy. For polling, if you have students or who's ever on the Zoom call on their phone, can they still answer the poll?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kathy. They can answer the polls. One of the issues with students who are only on their phone, so some students may log in on their computer, but use the audio from their phones if they don't have a good connection. But if they're only on their phones, because there's a Zoom app for Android and iOS phones, sorry for the Windows and BlackBerry people, there aren't any for those. There's some limitations, especially with like breakout rooms and some of the other features. But polling works on regardless of how they join. And as I mentioned, as well in regards to polling, if you already use Poll Everywhere, because Rush licenses Poll Everywhere, you may have used it in your face-to-face courses, you can use a Poll Everywhere in your session, live online session, and Poll Everywhere definitely supports phone responses as well. They even support the old school flip phone text only phones for certain question types, for multiple choice, etc. Okay. To answer your question, Kathleen?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. So moving on, this is a good template, and again, it's fillable, so you can type in that, and you'll get this handout to help you guide you through a three-step process of designing your live online instruction. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you do on that coming up, but just to point this out, with any instruction, we should start with the learning objectives. And even before that, you should start with your program or department's curriculum map. So you know kind of what courses and objectives came before students take your course, and what objectives and courses come after the students take your course as a step zero. But then the first step for your particular course is obviously the learning objectives, determine factors of which way they learn the best. So, you know, if it's something more of a clinical type scenario, say with standardized patients, that's probably done better live online than asynchronous online through like Blackboard or Elantra, assuming that you could not physically get to the simulation lab, or If you have to social distance in the simulation lab, you may have students rotate between doing the OSCEs in person versus live online. And we do have colleagues doing virtual OSCEs. We're having really good success with that here at Rush. And obviously they're doing it across the country. I've attended some sessions has anyone ever did any virtual OSCEs?
We've had the standardized patient. I've been a student and from the clinical faculty side with the sim lab.
Okay, doing them virtually or just
yeah, virtually over Zoom.
Yeah, that's great. What'd you think about that?
It actually worked out really well because we used the breakout rooms, and the standardized patients would stay in their own breakout rooms, and then we'd send the students to each breakout room. So it was like they're walking into the patient's actual room. So it was really cool.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that, Hannah. And then other influencing factors, i.e. COVID-19 pandemic, right? So that would be something we definitely are other factors for the fall, and who knows beyond the fall, hopefully not beyond the fall. And then the different activity options. So are you going to do a poll? Are you going to do a breakout room? Are you going to use Zoom's polling feature? Or are you going to use a third-party polling system such as Poll Everywhere? And some notes. So again, this is a little fillable cheat sheet, if you will, to help you plan that is your sessions. Next, I'll talk about some best practices from converting your in-person class to online class. That's what a lot of us had to do for this fall coming up. And so you don't want to take away from the activity. If you already have a active learning course in there, there's no need to cut that out in the live online. Such as I always joke around, joke that you can essentially do everything live online that you could do in person in the physical classroom, except for shake the faculty member's hand and partake in the snacks. If we plan well enough, maybe, and we have a budget, we can send a gift card to everyone before the sessions to get the snacks. So, but seriously, it's very rare that there isn't some way that we can get very close to what you do in the physical classroom in the live online session. I found that faculty find it easier to teach live online than they do to build a Blackboard or Canvas or a Elantra site and teach asynchronously in my experience doing this, and according to the research literature. In the live online space, you want to look for ways to involve everyone in the activity. And that's the same with face-to-face, but live online, you maybe have a little better option with that, in the sense that students can engage with resources that they might not have in the physical classroom. So they may have some, they'll be on a computer, for example, participating with live online or a smartphone, and so they can participate in it where they may be kind of hesitant, or you may not allow them to use their smartphones during your live class sessions. But it's assumed with live online and any online, it's pretty much all resources available. You definitely want to keep the counts the same, if not smaller. So I know some of our courses are large, like in the medical school, college rather, in the medical college, it's 150 some people in the courses, in one and two, but they have like 10, 12 faculty with it. So trying to keep the same ratios and not expanding. Just because we can have 300 people in a Zoom session at one time doesn't mean that we should teach a course like that, unless we're going to have, maybe 20 instructors in that 300 person class with that. And so, and then number 4 is very, very key. Even though our classes typically run 3 hours, 4 hours, you do not want to do the whole 3 or 4 hours live online. The best practice is around 60 minutes or an hour to an hour and a half. Definitely not more than 2 hours, and that's including breaks. That Zoom fatigue, and I'll have some resources about that coming up, is a real scientific issue. It's cognitive science. You know, it's a real scenario of Zoom fatigue. It's not just a faddish term. There's actually cognitive science research behind that, why we get fatigued and these web conferencing sessions with that. So back to the planning, one of the first things I work with faculty in doing is to identify which learning objectives require students to either perform a skill in real time or require the learning objects that require students to collaborate in real time. Things that they, what do they need to do that requires synchronicity, you know, real time assessments or real time interaction with that, and select those learning objectives and corresponding activities and assessments for your precious 60 to 90 minutes of live instruction. So then you would have the other part of the content in your LMS. So there's a pre-work. So if you use the flip the course model, or if you use team-based learning where you do your IRATs and videos and other work before you come to the live session or do the TRATs. And so you build it in. So essentially what this is saying is that there's no purely synchronous live online course, and really there's no purely asynchronous only online course, because the research shows that the best results for student learning and performance come from a blended learning with it. So even if you were teaching an asynchronous online course, it's a good and best practice to have optional live sessions. So that's kind of what we're doing with the OTCD course. It's an asynchronous course. However, we have these optional live sessions for you for certain topics, and to give you an opportunity maybe to get some real-time interaction and questions answered more immediately than waiting for a post and a discussion, et cetera, with that. Now, faculty would say, well, you know, some of the students might have an issue that they're spending only an hour and a half or 2 hours out of that 3 or 4 hours that they normally would. And so what I recommend for that, based on best practices, is that you can integrate after the hour and a half to 2 hours of the formal class time, if you will. You can use the other hour or 2 hours for additional student collaboration, for additional office hours. And so students are still getting their quote unquote money's worth of that 4 hour, 3 hour scheduled class time. It's just, sorry, I'm having, it's just designed in a different way that's more beneficial to do what needs to be done or is best done. Synchronously is done that way. What's best done or needs to be done asynchronously is done in that manner as well. So that's the key for that. And then 5 is, again, what needs to be self-paced and online. We kind of talked about this with the other ones, but making that decision early on. Any questions about this component of the converting your in-person class to online, live online? Okay, so next, again, as I talked, this book has a lot of great checklists, which is helpful. This is just a little cheat sheet for you can use as a checklist to kind of do a high-level prep for your course. So looking at activities, visual aids, and participation materials. So what's helpful for the live online sessions, which could be helpful for any type of learning, is maybe having a student guide that the students use, so they can print that out and use it to take notes, use it in the prep work or pre-work. So you want to consider these things on this checklist, which again, a lot of what I'm saying for the synchronous online instruction could be readily applicable to any type of instruction with that. And so I won't go over the blended learning curriculum. We'll talk more about that in our HighFlex session. But again, the key is even when you teach live online, you're going to use asynchronous online resource. You have to, essentially. It almost impossible to really facilitate the students fully and adequately without, and similarly with an asynchronous online course, it's really helpful to have that optional live online sessions for the students as well. And again, nice fillable handle, and these will be provided to you as well. So next I'll talk about a sample session planner. So it's definitely good if you don't already use a lesson plan or kind of a lesson outline, to have one, and especially in a hybrid or live online session. You know, what you're going to do with the in-person students or the live online students, and then if students can't make it, what do you have available in the LMS in case they miss, besides just the recordings. This next resource and best practice uses is really more of a, it says observation form. I'd like to say that it's a reflection form. So you could use this in preparing yourself beforehand, as well as kind of reflecting after your live online sessions. You know, you and your colleagues maybe can take turns observing each other and take turns reflecting as well on the sessions that you facilitate in there. So it's a good checklist in prepping and reflecting. And one of the best practices and evidence-based practices that we recommend is that when you have a live online course, or even a HighFlex course where there's live online components, anything that has live online component, it may be helpful to have a colleague or a graduate student or a volunteer from the class. You know, we go back to our kindergarten days, and you know, you rotate the teacher's helper for that particular class, and they can help you look at the chats. They could help you maybe with some technical issues. So we saw we had some microphone issues. Can happen to anybody. Like I said, it happened. And so they can help you kind of with this. So some people call it a producer, some call it assistant, some it might be co-instructors. So when you want to do this, so this could be a tool to help prep folks to help you with your session, and again, reflection. One example of, with the pandemic, we're planning for the COVID-19 pandemic, excuse me, in the fall, is that some departments where they have staff that maybe worked the front desk or did something based on students being on campus, but maybe those staff, if the students aren't on campus, they might be willing to learn and help facilitate the session in this virtual producer way. So this is something you could use with the staff, and they'd learn some additional skills or enhance these skills if they already have them, and show some more evidence of hopefully not being furloughed because the students aren't on campus, but they're serving this other helpful purpose to help the students and the faculty with it. Any questions on the observation forms / reflection forms checklist? Okay, so another best practice, and again, this is for any instructor. I almost feel, you know, as a disservice to say these are best practices for live online. It really can be applicable, as I mentioned, for a variety of delivery modes. But this is a tool called ONET. I use it a lot. It's from the U.S. Department of Labor, and they basically do surveys of professionals in virtually every field that the U.S. Department of Labor tracks. And so I'll go ahead and put this in the chat, actually, because this isn't a handout. This is actually a website. Has anyone used ONET? Why I typed this in the chat? Or anyone heard of ONET? Right. So ONET, like I said, let's look at, we'll go look at nurse practitioner. What the little sunshine spreads are bright outlooks. So those are careers that have higher than average growth rate rates predicted. So we'll look at nurse practitioners. So when you click on that, you can do a search. I just went to the healthcare, but you can search on any term, and it will bring up occupation. So it gives a little report. It notes the different job titles that it may have. You can do a summary of details. Based on the survey respondents, they identify which tasks were, you know, important and the level of importance, what technology, the tools they use, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and work activity. And what's nice with these, you can click on the skill and see what other occupation maybe uses that skill or activity with that. So what's helpful with this is in maybe creating learning objectives. For example, you can use something like ONET to maybe help you with doing this. So maybe you're doing the basic science course, but you want to provide some at least reference to applications, and maybe they don't have enough of the science yet to actually apply it fully. I mean, they can apply at different levels, but so this can help you with your learning objectives and case scenarios, things of that nature, role playing with that. And then it talks about skills, education requirements, and interest areas. So it's very, very comprehensive, and you can look at salaries and all. So that's a tool that I've used with faculty at various institutions that maybe are not teaching in an applied discipline, so they're maybe not as aware of some of the professions that their students are going to go into because they teach the general education or maybe the basic sciences aspects of the curriculum. And this will help with that as well. Another resource for keeping the instruction authentic are case studies. And I know everyone uses case studies, but I wanted to bring your attention to, if you haven't used Access Medicine. Has anyone used Access Medicine? Okay, good. See some people using the voting. So one says yes, one says no, and the other have abstained. So what Access Medicine is, a database that Rush subscribes to, and you can go in and you can go to cases and you can do a search for different cases. So if I click on cases, I can look at different case files. So I could go to, or you could just search, you know, for a case. So if you know specifically what type of case you want to go to, coronary heart disease, And so it gives you some case-like questions. It talks about approaches. Some of them have these nice, it's called anatomy pearls. You can listen to it as a student. It has references. And some of them also have comprehension questions. I'll sign into this. So this is a free account. So you need your Rush account to log in, and then for this component where you look at the getting actual other resources, you just create a free account. So if you want more information or would like more information regarding Access Medicine and all the other helpful resources that we have in the library, you'd want to contact your friendly neighborhood librarian here at Brush. So once I logged into the free additional access, it could take these little quizzes with that. So they're like micro cases, if you will, these little quizzes based on actual real cases. For those who have used Access Medicine, what would you like to say about it?
I found it fairly helpful. It has a lot of nice text in it. I kind of use that in some of the textbooks in the clinical key, which is also available through the website. Like they have Netter's Anatomy Atlas and a lot of other commonly used texts.
Great, thank you. Anyone else care to add? So next I'll go into engagement. We always hear the term, keep the students engaged with that. And that might mean different things to different people, might mean the same thing, etc. But here, using a resource from NSYNC Training, they, again, no financial ties or affiliation with this company, but they do a lot. Jennifer Hoffman is the owner. They do a lot of great work and provide a lot of great resources regarding live online training in corporate and higher academia as well. And so we're talking about engagement. We're talking about environmental engagement, intellectual engagement, and emotional engagement as three major components of engagement for learning. And so this is a nice, I think it's a nice, helpful infographic with not only what to do, but what you don't want to do, what's recommended not to do for engagement. And so the first level aspect is environmental engagement. So part of the environment would be the tools that you use. So the Zoom, so making sure the students know how to use Zoom and how to engage with the content and interact with you and their students, their classmates via the tool that you're using, whether it be Blackboard, Elantra, Zoom, or any other tool. So that environmental, even physically environmental. So in the club rooms, the collaborative hub rooms on the 5th floor and the 4th floor, the anatomy lab or the SIM center, to make sure they have the students have some type of orientation, are well prepared to engage fully, because they understand if they don't understand the environment or haven't used the environment, that could negatively affect their environmental engagement with it. So the next aspect is intellectual engagement, and this relates, somewhat to what we talked about, authentic learning with it. So to stimulate the learning. So a lot of if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, in your live online structure, you want to try to focus on the higher levels, on, application and evaluation and creation. And for the lower levels of, for recall and some other didactical areas, you can do that asynchronously in the LMS, where they can practice in terms and concepts and then come to the live sessions ready to apply those with that. So to keep intellectual engagement high. And then the emotional engagement. So we know, from students, the pandemic has had a big toll on not only academically, but, probably or likely or potentially, in every other aspect of their lives with that. And so to have students emotionally engaged, to provide them opportunity to, interact with each other, maybe in a less formal way. So back to where we talked about, it's recommended to have a maximum of an hour and a half to 2 hours, including the breaks, for a session, a live online session. And we could use that other hour to hour and a half or 2 hours as a flexible collaboration time for students. Or maybe you could carve out some time where maybe you have some informal interaction with the students live online, just to kind of check in with students and more than just the academic aspects of their lives with that. So to kind of build community and support on that. Any questions or comments about engagement? Okay. And then finally, we're talking about cognitive load. So as I mentioned, the Zoom fatigue is a very real issue. Actually, this is a website, so I will copy and paste this in the chat. And one thing that I would really mention as part of the Zoom fatigue is that a lot of times faculty talk about wanting, requiring the students to turn on their videos and keep them on, because it helps them, it helps the faculty member feel like they actually, have students in front of them. But one of the major trade-offs for that is that video could negatively impact the student's internet connection. If the student has a poor or not the best internet access or connection, video takes up more bandwidth. And the best practice is really not to use video unless it's tied to a learning objective. So yes, if you need to see them perform OSCE virtually, yes, then they need to have their camera on so you can see them perform that assessment and whether or not they meet the learning objective. But if you're doing more of a didactic component in that session, or something that does not really require people to see each other necessarily, or for you to see the students or them to see you, then it's really more of a detriment for, even though psychologically you may feel better about it, it's really potentially hampering the student participation, adding to the Zoom fatigue with that. And so the key is use the video. The happy medium is to require students to post a picture in their profile in Zoom. So as you see with my camera, or excuse me, in my session, I just use my picture typically. I would only turn on my camera maybe if I haven't worked with someone before initially, and during the introduction. And so maybe you might do that in the initial session, and then after that, just use the picture in the profile, and that looks better than just seeing the the black boxes with names. So adding the picture in the profile is helpful. One of the other, I'll post this Zoom fatigue from Harvard Business Review. One of the other issues with Zoom fatigue is that seeing your own video has been reported to cause additional fatigue as well. This is with fatigue, Zoom fatigue number 2. So I'm posting this in the chat as well with it. And so just to be mindful for that. So we don't recommend requiring students to show video if it's not tied to a specific learning objective, a specific type of assessment. And so you can use it, requires them to use their picture because we require students to wear IDs in the building. So I think there shouldn't be any burden for students to have their picture in their Zoom profile with that. And so that would conclude the presentation. I wanted to make sure we left a lot of time for additional question and answers. So I will stop sharing my screen and see if you have any additional questions, comments. You can feel free to use the microphone or type them in the chat. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any additional questions at this time. I'll put in City's email address. So if you do have any other questions, oh, thank you, Kathleen, for that about the Zoom fatigue. Yeah, it's a real thing, and the video adds to it. So we want to be careful with that. So I'll put in City's email address in the chat if you have any other questions, and then City's help email address if you want to make sure if you need a Poll Everywhere account or something like this, or you know you need access to some tools like Blackboard or a thing that nature, you can reach out to City Help, and that's more of our technical support from a user account, break it, fix it type scenario. And that's at cityhelp@rush.edu. Okay. Well, again, we know you have a choice in who you choose for your professional development. So we thank you for choosing City. Hope that you have a great rest of your day and weekend, and you get back 11 more minutes. Thank you and have a great day.